So that'll be part of the news that the Fed will help supply. And what they're trying to do is potentially shape expectations. So they might be kind of playing a role even with the demand and consumers on what they're going to do. So what they say is important. Sometimes what they wear is important. It's mostly kind of myths or tales, but they said when Alan Greenspan, the former chair, used to testify, if he was wearing a blue tie, it meant it was going to be a decrease. If he was wearing a red tie, he would be going up. So somebody had kind of noticed that he seemed to wear a different tie. And so Wall Street is there hinging on what they're going to say, because what they have to say is going to have an impact on the valuation of bonds like we did last time, right? What was a bond again? Government loan, so government borrowing was the one we talked about. So Trump can't pay for weapons of mass destruction because we're not raising taxes enough to pay for spending, which is what the government's been doing for the last 40 years or so. Trump's not alone, of course. Obama did the same thing in the last 40 years worth of presidents, basically. And so they sign one of these things, and they're like, okay, I promise to pay you back. I owe you $1 million, and they'll borrow from different places. Bonds can also be done by corporations, and so they're publicly traded financial assets is what a bond is. And we'll come back to that again as we did before. All right, so the shifters then, any of the three tools will shift the money supply. And I gave those to you last time, the three tools. So we have the discount rate. If the Fed decreases the discount rate, I might not have used that abbreviation. Let me just write that out. The discount rate, what was that again? The discount rate, you should have it in your notes if you flip back.
The rate for banks, if they want to borrow money.
Yeah, so if a member bank, an American bank, well, I mean, they can be member banks from other places, but if a bank in the banking system needs to borrow from the central bank, because that was its original function, to be the banker's bank, then the interest rate they charge them is the discount rate. That interest rate is the lowest rate in the nation. So it's usually the cheapest rate. Banks can also get loans from other banks. And does anybody know what that rate is called? If you read ahead in your book, it's probably worth an extra credit point. Of course, remember, no Googling or anything. All of you guys with your laptops are not on your thing. What is the rate that banks charge other banks for short-term loans? So instead of going to the Federal Reserve and borrowing at the discount rate, they can also go to another bank. No, good guess. You're totally wrong, Bryce, but for that guess, since everybody was quiet, and I appreciate wrong answers too, so you guys every once in a while are going to get extra credit for totally wrong answers. And that was a perfect example, so thank you, Bryce. You're totally wrong, but you're getting extra credit today. All right, so it's called the federal funds rate. So the federal funds rate is kind of usually the second lowest rate. It's usually approximately equal to the discount rate.
Why would they ever do that?
Because it might be easier than going to the Fed. So over the years, there was a little bit of a stigma of going to the central bank. It's like going to your parents for a loan. Yeah. You'd rather go to your friends. Like, hey, I only need $20. If I go to my parents, they're going to ask me, well, what do you need the $20 for? Are you doing okay, honey? And you got a big, long conversation on the phone, right? So there's been historically a little bit of a stigma about going to the central bank because of that reason, because it usually signaled maybe there was a problem. But the spread is very low, and sometimes it's even under this is something we get into in advanced classes a little bit more, approximately equal to the discount rate.
Do you give a report when you get money from central bank?
Yeah, all of that's recorded. Yeah. Here's what happens in the real world for banks. It doesn't necessarily signal they're in trouble, but if a person, let's say of decent wealth, comes in and says, hey, listen, I'm switching banks. Sorry, I'm gone. I want my $1 million, right? And so they had $1 million on deposit. They take it away and put it in another bank. Can that bank who lost the million, do they have the million, first of all?
Probably not.
not in cash totally, right? But they have it in terms of maybe some credits if they know it's being transferred to another bank. The cash can be there if they need it to be there. But if you do $1 million withdrawal at any place, you better give them some lead time because they need to figure it out. But they certainly can't call in all their loans, right? And so what the bank might need to do is like, oh, well, we can have the money in 3 days, but we don't have it right now. Every day at the close of business, your books have to be correct with the required reserve ratio. What was the required, I'm going to be putting it on the board here, but what was the required reserve ratio? 20%. Well, 20% is what I used in that example.
Oh, what is it?
It's actually closer to like 10 and even less. It's kind of a sliding scale, and yeah, and it can be, it varies depending on the capacity of your bank. So I just use that as an example, but it's the amount that the bank can't loan out, right? And so in theory, they have to have that amount, not in theory, by law, they have to have that amount is in required reserves at the end of the close of business. So what they do is like, oh, millionaire John just came in and took $1 million out of my account at 5 minutes to 5 before the close of business. I can't come up with $1 million that fast. Let me call up my buddy at Chase Manhattan Bank. Hey, can I borrow $1 million tonight or for 2 days? Sure, no problem. Federal funds rate, the banks make a loan with each other. They actually state the rate, it's a market rate, but they'll have it posted what they're willing to do interbank loans with each other. And so then Chase, of course, had the $1 million because John just dumped $1 million on his bank books. So the bank books are in fluctuation day by day, and they have to make good with them at the end of the day. And so they can either go to the central bank to make sure their reserve requirement is met, or they can go to a member bank and borrow for that.
Do banks typically stay above the reserve ratio rate just in case something like that happens?
It depends. So the pendulum kind of swings. So since the financial crisis in 2008, definitely. They're usually above the required reserve rate because cash is kind of king. Everybody was a little bit worried. The pendulum's kind of swung out before where to make more money, you need to be making loans, right? Remember the spread we talked about? They're paying you guys next to nothing on savings accounts and time deposits, and then they could go make another car loan or a construction loan or something and make 6%, make money off of that. So there's a profit motive to get that out, assuming that it's not volatile. So as we go through a period of time where our levels are pretty stable, the economy's growing, things look good, expectations for profits are good, I probably don't have default rates, people are able to make their loan payments. You see what I'm saying? We kind of got a nice, stable, expected profit environment. Then they're going to be starting to loan out close to that max, all of the excess reserves. So then you might have more need for this if one person comes out. Okay, so discount rate, if they drop the interest rate, is that going to lead to an increase or decrease in the money supply? I gave you that last time too. So the money supply, if interest rates are lower and banks are borrowing more money, it's going up. So the supply of money is going to go up. Now we're going to treat that with our model as a shift to the right. So in this graph, if the money supply, if the discount rate falls, the money supply shifts to the right. What's going to happen to interest rates? Down, right? So we're starting here, and now the new equilibrium levels to the lower than where we started. So an increase, decrease in the discount rate causes an increase in the money supply, a shift to, let's call it now, M1 to MS2. And the result is an interest rate drop from I1, let's just say it's 4%, to 3%. I2 equals 3%, just making up some numbers.
Is that good for the borrower and bad for the lender?
So yeah, there's going to be two people on the side of this equation. So as interest rate falls, if your great grandma living on a fixed income, having some of those time deposits, do you like that move? Lower interest rates. Does that help you pay for your bills? No. So grandma gets cheated a little bit from interest rates falling, but now the general direction of interest rates is less. Car loans might be less, mortgage loans, there might be some tripling of other interest rates in the economy that decrease. Okay, number 3 is a decrease in the required reserve ratio. So we go from, let's say, 0.2 to 0.1. What happens to the money supply? Increase or decrease if now banks don't have to hold as much money back? Increase, right? So we're going to have more of those loans going out. That'll lead to an increase in the money supply. And ultimately, a decrease in interest rates if the Fed does that. So more money is going to be out in the system. And then finally, what gave us a increase in the money supply? An open market purchase or sale leads to an increase in the money supply. There's a good fill-in-the-blank question for your homework and test coming up. An open market purchase or an open market sale of bonds? Purchase. All right, let's test it out. Purchase. So purchase, was that you, Caleb? Okay. So remember, the bond was originally sold by Trump, not Jerome Powell, by the way, right? So Trump is the one who needed weapons of mass destruction, went out to the market, and that is now being traded on Wall Street. I am Jerome Powell, the central bank, and I'm going to do an open market purchase. So I'm going to bring my money to the market, go to Wall Street, and buy a bond. What happened to the money supply? Is she right? Did it go up or down? It went up. She's right. So visualize that. That's going to help you on some of your homework problems. Remember, I'm the Federal Reserve, and then kind of picture the bond leaving the system, leaving Wall Street, and money supply going up. All right, so an open market purchase. And as we talked about last time, this is the most common thing that the Federal Reserve does to change the money supply. All right, questions on that? So those are your 4 tools. So an open market sale, you know, all of this goes vice versa, right? An increase in the discount rate, an increase in the required reserves, or an open market sale is going to flip the arrow the other direction in terms of the shift. So the way I described it, when there's an increase in money supply, is the, what do you think? Adding more money to the system, is the Fed trying to boost the economy or kind of dampen it in terms of economic activity if we're adding more money?
Boost it.
We're trying to boost it, right? So get some more money out of the system, lower interest rates, maybe we have more people borrowing, whatever. And so that's called expansionary monetary policy. So what we just did with these three tools, let's just put a little note. Any increase in money supply, an increase in the money supply, a shift to the right, is called expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy. So any actions by the central bank are called monetary policy. If, on the other hand, it's Trump and Congress that are changing taxes, changing spending, doing something else, what do we call that type of policy, that type of government policy? Does anybody know? If Trump and Congress change the tax rates, change government programs, increase welfare benefits. Fiscal policy, good, Lawson. So that's probably worth an extra credit point. I'm feeling generous today. So Lawson, fiscal policy. Lawson, what's your last name again? With an M? So fiscal policy is that So expansionary monetary policy and a decrease in money supply when these things move the other direction. Interest rates are going to go up. We're contracting the money supply, and so we call it contractionary monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy. If Trump decreases tax rates like he did at the start of his administration, was he looking to help the economy or to tamp it down? Is that hoping to make the economy heat up and have some economic growth, or was it trying to make it dampen?
Sold as expansion.
Sold as expansionary policy. So it's expansionary fiscal policy. We'll get into that. I'm just kind of foreshadowing a little bit. When we get to the fiscal policy chapter, was our last week together. We'll get into the government stuff. But so the main thing in this chapter is remember the Federal Reserve and Trump and Congress are separate entities. So the independence of the Fed is an important concept. Did Jacob talk to you about the independence of the Fed? Remember that from last Friday? So I'll just say a few words about it. You'll see it in the reading. But one of the ways we design the system is that the Federal Reserve chairman and the board and stuff does not have to answer to Congress or the president. So they're completely independent. All the decisions that they do, they don't have to pass it by. Trump doesn't have veto power. The money supply in the United States is independently controlled by the Federal Reserve, our central bank. And of course, taxes, revenues, all the stuff, Trump, weapons of mass destruction, going to war with other countries, all those fiscal policies, that's Trump and Congress over here in that branch, right? And then, of course, we have the judicial branch too, the three functions of government. But the central bank is completely independent. Why? Why would that be important to be independent? By the way, not all countries are independent with their central banks. I think pretty much all the developed countries are, but a lot of the developing countries have struggled with this over time. To give you a hint, why would we want complete independence? So basically, this has happened this year because you know Trump likes to run his mouth, right? So Trump would tweet something about Jerome Powell and say, I think the Fed, is awful that they're not decreasing interest rates. They must hate me. I think Jerome Powell's an idiot or something. Jerome Powell, being the guy that he is, didn't do this, but he could literally do this. He won't get fired. Trump is not his boss. He can literally tell him to go to hell. He didn't. He probably did in professional ways. But the independence of the Fed is something real and real important. So anything Congress or the president does, they have no claim on the decisions of the Fed. It is true independence. So back to my question, why is that independence important? Why do we want the chairman of the Federal Reserve to be able to do that? So they're not being controlled, and why would that be important? What might a president, whether it's, this goes across party lines, of course, whether it's Obama or Trump or any other president in the course of history, what might they like to have the central bank do? Especially come election time, like this would be the perfect time right now.
Drop interest rates.
Drop interest rates. Do some expansionary monetary policy, right? Because then come election time, woo, the economy's doing good, even though that might have been a terrible thing to do for the long run growth of the economy because it caused inflation or something. They might do that. They also could say, oh, let's go kill some people over in the Middle East. Okay, dial up me $100 million. When we talked about printing money, that would potentially allow the president or Congress that function. And so we don't want that to happen. We want that to be completely independent, keeping the money supply nice and stable, trying to achieve some of our objectives. We haven't talked about these for a little bit. What are the three policy goals, three policy items that we hope all of these people are keeping in mind as they make decisions? What are the three biggies in macro? this is the first things we learned, and not the first week, but when we got into the actual macro material. The 3 biggies, 3 goals. What are the 3 variables that we monitor pretty closely? Inflation. Let's stop on inflation. What's our goal for inflation? Do we want it
Stable.
and
Low.
Low and stable is kind of the policy goal. The stated policy goal currently of the Federal Reserve is 2%. That's what they're targeting inflation at. They'd like to keep it around 2. So they'll do some shifting of the money supply and interest rates, but their #1 objective is to keep inflation stable around 2%. That's one of the things that the United States, from a policy standpoint, has been trying to do, keep it around 2%. Okay, what are the other 2 biggies? Unemployment, get it to 0?
Natural rate.
Natural rate, so unemployment at the natural rate of unemployment. And then finally, #3,
Real GDP.
real GDP, and we want it going up or down? Up. Maybe not up too fast, but nonetheless, increasing, we want economic growth, so real GDP going up. Okay, so we kind of hope that's all going on. In your text, you'll see that the primary goal, as I said, is inflation for the Federal Reserve, but they also have a secondary mandate for unemployment. And so they might face at some point some trade-off, but they're keeping their eye on unemployment. So in other words, if inflation is below its target, below 2%, then maybe they'll do a little monetary policy to try to get employment a little bit better than what it is. If you make some efforts that way. So that's kind of what's called the dual mandate of the central bank. Okay, so let's get into our shifters here for money demand. Money demand shifters. Things that are going to make now the demand curve move to the left or to the right. Okay. Demand curve shifters. Okay, so #1, these are the things we're holding constant along the demand curve. So a change in real GDP. If there's an increase in real GDP, what do you think? Was that going to lead to a increase or decrease in the demand for money?
Increase.
Increase. Why?
People are spending more money.
Okay, people are spending more money. People probably want to spend more money, so they want more things, actually, right? So when you guys get your first job and you're maybe out with your apartment and you're making 40 grand a year or something, as your income went up from what you were making in college, 10,000 to 40,000, you're going to want to buy more things. To buy more things, what do you need to buy things with? Money. So the key to thinking about this one is that if you want more things, you need more money to buy things. And so when you have a higher income, when your income is stronger, then you're going to demand more money. So an increase in the demand for money, which is a shift to the right. So the key point here is real GDP equals your income. And an increase in income means you want to buy more stuff, and you need more money to buy more stuff. Okay. So when economic growth is happening, like it is in the United States currently, what's your prediction on interest rates? If the economy's growing, would you predict interest rates to go up or down?
Down.
Down? Why? Just felt good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad you said that because what we want to do is we're going to use these tools to check our guts because sometimes your gut is going to lie to you and your intuition's not going to be there. So let's use our tool. Let's pretend that we're currently at 3%, so MS2 and this demand curve. So if income goes up, what's happening to the money demand curve? Shift to the right. And so what's your prediction on interest rates? They're going to go up. Just using our tool. So once we've got the basics down, a shift to the right is going to cause interest rates to go up. Holding all of the things constant, remember when we do these shifts, this is that single thing happening. What's going to happen? Interest rates are going to tend to go up. So in a period of economic growth, we would expect interest rates to be climbing. Now, it's also true that when the economy is growing, the Federal Reserve might also do some contractionary policy, and that might help interest rates head back up as well. So there can be a couple things going on, moving parts, depending on how the Fed is viewing that. But what we're talking about here is money demand shifters in general. If people have more income, there's going to be an increase in the demand for money, which is going to raise the price of money, raise the interest rates. All right, any last comments, questions on that? All right, number 2 is a change in the expected price level. So if prices are expected to increase, do you want to buy in the future? So they're expected to increase in the future. Do you want to buy stuff today or tomorrow? Today. So if you're going to buy stuff today, what do you need to buy stuff today? Money. So it shifts the money demand curve to the right. So if prices are expected to increase, people will increase their money demand to buy more today while it's cheaper. So an increase in the price level, and to use our shorthand notation, leads to an increase in the money demand, shift to the right. Okay, the last one is financial innovation. Financial innovation. So we've had lots of those things over time. We've got the ATM machine kind of came about a little more popular when I was a youngster, real youngster. I think I got my first debit card, I don't know, sometime in the 80s. So ATMs, so people were able to go to the ATM and withdraw some cash. So debit cards, being able to draw money off your card similar to a credit card, so a debit card evolved. We got internet banking. And then, of course, all of our online access to finances. So my question to you is, how did that change the demand for money over time? Did you demand more money or less money as there was financial innovation? More. So you wanted more money. Why do you say that?
Because it was available. It was like you could get it much easier.
Okay. So you could get it easier. Let me go back to probably the oldest example possible. Let's think M1. So we can look at the demand for M1. What's in M1 again? Checking and currency and checkable deposits. And M1 was primarily the way people had use for transactions, right? And so now, and people would hold a decent amount of cash. I'm kind of an oddball because I'm a Dave Ramsey fan, and I tend to hold a decent amount of cash, but most people don't have more than 100 in their wallet because, oh, I just pay for everything with card. Like, who touches cash? Ooh, cash is dirty. Well, that's not me. But in the old days, people used to have to carry a lot of cash, or they'd write checks for things, right? If we go way back to even before I was born. So,
Sorry again. Okay.
So as people were able to pull money from their savings accounts, what happened to the demand for M1? The demand for carrying around cash and holding it in the form of a checking account. It went down, right? And so now what you can do is you can do a withdrawal from your stock portfolio pretty easily, right? You can actually do a draw from your balance, your broker in Wall Street can kind of do a transfer, and you can pretty much be spending that money in pretty short time, like draining some of your stock portfolio. So as people have easier access to what we'd say are less liquid assets, like stocks and bonds and cars and houses, right? Houses are some of the least liquid assets you can own. Because if you want to, like, oh, I got equity in my house, how do I get it, right? Well, I need to sell my house. Oh, how long is that going to take, right? So it's not easy to convert that asset into cash. But as innovations have happened, that's caused people to actually have less demand for money as they had greater access. So financial innovation kind of depends, but in general, I'll just do this example. Easier access to less liquid financial assets. So savings accounts, stocks, stock portfolio, stock and bonds. Easier access to less liquid financial assets leads to a decrease in money demand. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the money market. The main thing here is then all these shifters, you can tell stories you'll see in your homework. Okay, so that causes, if you have these shifters memorized, then you can take a little problem on a homework problem or test and say, oh, okay, there's the money demand, money supply. And maybe let me work through this because we haven't done that yet here. So let's see. Key to using graphs in general. I'll use this one as an example. Those of you who had me for micro, you're gonna, this is gonna sound familiar. Start with home base. Home base is something I kind of invented, that the economy is currently at some situation, right? There's some interest rate, there's some unemployment, there's some GDP, there's something somewhere. And so in our money market, if we have interest rates and money, there's a starting place. That is home base. Where the two lines cross gives us our starting interest rate and our starting quantity of money. So you can do that with the labor market, with wages. You can do that in these other ones we're going to do later. Then something happens. There's something going on here, and so maybe there's an increase in expected inflation. So now I have that memorized as a demand shifter. and that's going to increase the money demand today. So at PL1, let's call it PL1, the price level that was expected was 105. So currently, people in the economy were expecting a price level in the future of 105. Maybe we're at 100 now, so that'd be 5% inflation, right? But now, that's changed because Trump took over the central bank. And now the independence of the Fed is lost. And I don't know, what's happening here? And so now we expect the price level to be higher than it was before. That causes an increase in the demand for money, shifting it to the right. MDPLE, let's call it 2, equaling 108. So now I think there's going to be 8% inflation. And the result is that today, interest rates climb to I2. That's using our tool, right? Something shocks the system, and then we're able to look at what we expect the result will be. What's the prediction that you make after that thing happened? And then, of course, money supply, if the Federal Reserve didn't do anything, the money supply quantity stayed the same, interest rates just went up. Okay, questions on that? Okay, so we got one big topic left to talk about. And it kind of involves one of my favorite economists, Milton Friedman, Uncle Milty. So, Uncle Milty looked at some data. Looked at some data that showed a relationship between money supply and inflation. So he was looking at the connection between the money supply and inflation. And so he said that money is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. It's always due to the central bank. If I can find my notes here. We're going to do this one. Okay, we'll just wait. So, he was thinking about the equation for nominal GDP. So, Milton Friedman, and the quantity theory of money. This is pretty much the work that got him the Nobel Prize in Economics, our highest award. And he looked at this equation and thought about a connection between money and nominal GDP. So nominal GDP is equal to the price level times the quantity of real GDP. So price times quantity. So I'll just put in parentheses, this is real GDP. When we did the inflation chapter, remember we had the price level was equal to nominal GDP divided by real GDP. So if I put this little sucker over here, I've got what I have on the board, right? So check it out. Nominal GDP, we did that whole exercise. That's how we created the index, the consumer price index, or this was really called the GDP deflator. So nominal GDP could be thought of to be price level times real GDP. Let's just call it Y, because we've been using that as our abbreviation for real GDP. So this is really nothing more than price times quantity is what we're trying to get at. So real GDP is what we care about. This, of course, is reflecting prices and inflation. Everybody with me so far? So then this is the kind of the clever thing. Milton said, well, we need money to buy the $20 trillion worth of stuff that we buy every year. We need money. So we have a quantity of money. So M here is the quantity of money. So this could be M2 or it could be M1. We're just going to call it M, but it's like our money supply we were doing earlier. That is the quantity of money. Does anybody remember what the quantity of money was? I showed it on the screen the last time. We had M1 and M2. Yeah, it's around 13.5 trillion, I think. So we have $20 trillion worth of exchanges being done with, 11 or 13.5 trillion dollars worth of money. So Milton Friedman's thinking, okay, so there's less money than there is transactions. So money's being spent over and over in the economy. He called that the velocity of money. So V is the velocity of money. And this is the average number of times a dollar is spent. I don't know why I'm choosing to write all this up here, so sorry. Velocity of money, the definition is the average number of times a dollar gets spent. Okay, that's it. So he said the dollar value of exchanges, the nominal dollar value of exchanges, is equal to the quantity of money times the velocity of money. So here's where the theory part comes in. So this is called the equation of exchange. So this thing here is called the equation of exchange. And then the quantity theory of money, quantity theory, I'm going to rewrite it here. The quantity theory of money, here's the theory. Here's the definition. If in the long run, real GDP growth is stable or fixed, it's going to be what it's going to be. If in the long run, real GDP growth is stable and velocity is stable, constant, we have a relationship between money supply and the price level. And I'm curious if any of you see it. So let's look at the equation of exchange again. If this is fixed, so in math class, sometimes we put a little bar over it. So real GDP is stable or fixed, it's going to be what it's going to be. And if velocity, the number of times money gets spent, there's no reason to think that that would be jumping all over the place, that all of a sudden the velocity is going to be up and down. If that's fixed and that's fixed, what's the relationship between the quantity of money and the price level? They're equal, okay, good. So that's part of it. We can even put that a little bit more now, thinking in terms of changes over time.
Increases at a constant rate.
Increases at a constant rate. So if this goes up by 3%,
so too this price level.
This goes up by 3%. If this goes up by 10%, this goes up by 10%. This goes up by 20%, this goes up by 20%. So remember where I started off the class today saying that money is the veil of the economy. We think it's important, but the real economy is the exchanges people are doing, right? And so in the long run, the real economy are those exchanges. And economic growth is going to be what it's going to be in the long run. If that's true, then proportional changes in money is going to lead to proportional changes in the price level. That was one of Milton's main contributions to the discussion in macroeconomics. So if in the long run real GDP growth is stable and velocity stable, then percentage change in money supply is going to be approximately equal, we'll put the little squiggly, otherwise equal to the percentage change in the price level. And his quote that he had was, inflation is everywhere and always a monetary or money, a monetary phenomenon. I'm not sure I can spell phenomenon, but I'll try there. Phenomenon. You guys can spell it on your own. It's a money thing. Okay, so he kind of started what economists call monetarism. So he has a very specific prescription for the economy in regard to money supply, and he's basically, don't fuss with it. Keep it low and stable, basically fixed. And then what this happens to this will happen to this. But more importantly, it won't cause uncertainty in the economy. So he wasn't a fan during his time when he wrote this. This was in the 60s. And the United States, what happened in like 64? Who was the president then? Kind of had a little problem with a bullet. Kennedy, right? So we had the 60s. We're coming out of World War II. A lot of government intervention was kind of on the rise on, oh, we can figure out the economy. We just need to inject a little money or pull back the money supply and change the interest rates. The government can have some programs. So we started the war on poverty, which was a pretty much an absolute failure. The war on poverty of building, housing for people so that they can, have massive subsidies for having a place to live. That turned out to be long run kind of a big failure. But the rise of government spending kind of continued to go up and intervention in the government. So Milton in the 60s said, I predict that's going to be inflationary. And everybody laughed at him. They thought, oh, there's no way that's true. We've got this economic stuff figured out. We just need to tinker with this and tinker with that. And they didn't believe him. And so then in 1970s, Milton Friedman looked like the best economist in the world because he basically predicted all of the inflation that we had in the 1970s. And it was because of what went on with the money supply. And so that wasn't a good thing to be continuing to tinker around with, long story short. So his prescription is closer to what we do today in the United States, although it's not there. He was really a little bit stronger in what he predicted, but to have more or less a fixed money supply so that the rate of change in the money supply would be stable and low. Okay, so Uncle Milty suggests that we should not do active discretionary monetary policy. And he is dead now, so maybe I should put suggested that we should not do active discretionary monetary policy. In other words, we're not really helping the economy too much by continuing to try to pump it up and bring it back and having active. So he was advised more of a fixed rule, advised for a fixed rule-based system. So in the most simplest form, it would be, for example, increase the money supply by 2%, always. Increase money supply by 2% each year, period. That's it. Because after you've learned the quantity theory of money, I can now ask principles of macroeconomics students, if the Federal Reserve is keeping the money supply fixed at 2%, what do you predict inflation will be? 2%. See how easy it is? It's like you don't even need to be a professional economist now to predict inflation. That is going to be the result. And so his advice and kind of this whole thing created what we call monetarism. So this whole policy prescription and the quantity theory of money, this is called monetarism. Another ism, monetarism, or he was called a monetarist. So there's kind of a group of economists that kind of evolved and lots of research looking at inflation and other things, and they were called the monetarists. Okay, questions or comments on that so far? Okay, so I want to do a little bit of show and tell here. What economists do is test out if some of these economic theories, so this is, by the way, a little blurb on the quantity theory of money. Does the quantity theory of money work? Economics in action, here's from your textbook, just what we just went through, velocity and all that. So here's data on money growth and inflation rate from 1990 to 2005. So we're looking at all the different types of money growth that's out there, and we see that there's this kind of upward slope to it that matches the rate of growth of the money supply. Now we're a little bit on the downside, and they'll talk a little bit about the reasons for that. There's a little bit of a lag time. But here again, around the globe, we see all of the data kind of clustered around here. This is getting into hyperinflation countries. That's why there's not as many of them, right? So we've got 50% inflation, 50% money growth, 50% inflation. We start to see that connection over a longer period of time. So that gives you a little glimpse of that. The last thing I want to show you is kind of the real formula that you'll see in your book as you work through. I kind of do the static method. Let me show you this part here, because this is where I left off. So this equation is what I put on the board and kind of tried to walk you through the logic of it, because I think that's easier than where they take it here. But we can also express the equation of exchange in growth rates. So MV equals price level times real GDP, right? So it's kind of the same thing, except it's expressed in percentage changes. So money growth, rate of velocity change, inflation, which is the rate of change of the price level, and real growth in GDP. And so the nice thing this does for us is it shows that the two would not actually, if velocity is fixed, which it does, I think they show a velocity picture, maybe not, they might just show it. Velocity does turn out to be pretty fixed. So if velocity is constant, if it goes from 10 to 10 next year and 10 next year, what's the percentage change? If it stays constant all the time, 10, 10, 10, what's the percentage change? 0, 10. I'm sorry, I wasn't talking about the percentage change. I was talking about if the price level stayed at 10, 10, 10, if it was fixed, the percentage change is 0, which makes it disappear from this equation. So this goes away, and now here's really the full equation. The inflation rate is equal to the money growth rate minus the real GDP growth rate. So the economy is going to grow at a positive amount, not fixed the way I had it in a static way. And so this really lines up nicely now with this. Because if we're subtracting off the inflation rate is the money growth rate minus inflation, now we're getting this picture here with the dots down below. Okay? All right. Well, that's a little heavy. So, the financial crisis kind of threw a little ringer into it. Do you guys know who the author of your textbook is? I thought it'd be right on the front of the textbook here. There it is, Parkin. Oh, well, it's Parkin Economics. So Michael Parkin is the author of the book. And I went to a workshop, which happened to be like in October of 2008, right after the financial crisis. And so I started, you know, I've been teaching econ like this for, at that time, 15 years or 20 years or something. So he's talking about inflation and the financial crisis. And I said, do you think that what the Federal Reserve is doing right now is going to be inflationary? You know, if I think back to the quantity theory of money, what was going on is the Federal Reserve was bailing out the banks. They did that by giving lots of loans. So they kind of added lots of money to the system. And they were buying kind of toxic assets off of banks. So banks were in trouble, right? They had people that weren't paying loans anymore. Some banks, not all banks, by the way. And so the Federal Reserve went to kind of the big banks and intervened with these bailout policies. And I thought, if they're actually buying toxic assets, isn't that going to be inflationary? So let me give you an example. So imagine that this is a corporate bond that a bank owns. So now we'll go to the Bank of Kaysen here. So you're a banker, and that bond is something that the Federal Reserve would normally buy government bonds. But during the bailout, Kaysen is in trouble. She's like, her bank is like really in bad shape. The person who she loaned money out to might not be paying it back, right? She got involved in subdivisions in Las Vegas and made huge loans, and that developer's going bankrupt now. So I'm going to go bail out the Bank of Kaysen. I'm Jerome Powell again. I'm going to do what I always do. Go buy a bond to give Kaysen the cash that she needs to make her depositors good, right? And to kind of keep her bank running. So I'm going to buy this piece of crap from her. Now, I'm the central bank and I own a piece of crap. Kaysen has her money. What happened to the money supply? It increased. What's happening to interest rates? See if you can start putting this stuff together now. Interest rates are going down, right?
Yeah.
So we had an increase in the money supply. Interest rates are going down. The Federal Reserve is trying to stimulate the economy. That's one way to do it. We do it the good old-fashioned way, except now I own a piece of crap. So when I find out that this thing is worthless, I come over to here and I drop it in the garbage can. what happens to the money supply now? What was happening before when Trump, I was using the example of Trump, but the corporation would make good. Remember the story? 5 years later, the money would come back to the Federal Reserve, right? And they would actually make money on it. But now, if this is crap, what just happened to the money supply permanently? It increased. Is that any different than the government running the printing press? I need some money. And go buy something. Same thing. It's kind of like running the printing press, somewhat in disguise. So that was my hunch. So I wrote an email after the session and the workshop. This was in Chicago. So it's Michael Parkin is the author of the textbook. So you can see I wrote this October 2nd of 2008. This was right on the front end of, we were still in a lot of turmoil. All we knew is that the banks were bailing out and buying toxic assets. He had mentioned this toxic asset. So one thing that stuck with me during your lunch talk was the change in the composition of the Fed's assets. I am not that knowledgeable with the details of the Fed, but I would guess that they do not charge off bad assets very often, since they normally hold all U.S. government securities. With bad assets in the Fed portfolio, is government running the printing press in a discrete way, basically that the public wouldn't kind of know about it unless you knew a few things. This practice will definitely lead to paying through the bailout with higher prices, as well as taxes, will it not? So there I was using the equation of exchange to think, if they're actually increasing the money supply, running the printing press, then we're going to have inflation. So that was my question to our textbook author back in 2008. Here's his response. Russ, I enjoyed our conversation last week. I think that we're heading toward the printing press. The Fed's balance sheet is in the table below between September 2007 and 2008. The monetary base, the total liabilities, increased by 14%, definitely inflationary if sustained. Look at the drop in safe government securities and the rise in loans to banks and other ties, quote unquote, or parentheses, sometimes toxic securities, up from 30 billion to 446 billion. And the US government securities down from 780 billion to 480. So I know Jacob, when he subbed for me, did a little bit of balance sheet work, which can sometimes be a little boring, but September 7th, this is the Fed's balance sheets in 07, September of 07. Federal Reserve notes, that's currency, right? That's the liabilities. If we're doing assets and liabilities, I know not all of you have had your accounting, so don't sweat this too much, but we do a little bit of the T things here. So we got bank deposits. These are deposits of member banks at the Fed, the required reserve ratio. They can actually have deposits with the Fed too. So assets and liabilities. And then what does the Federal Reserve have? They have a little bit of gold and foreign exchange, $780 billion worth of U.S. government securities. So they mostly had these, just the way I showed you on open market operations. They primarily had government securities, and then loans to banks, like maybe some banks that had the overnight loans, or maybe there's a little trouble of a few banks working some things out. That was kind of the normal picture. Financial crisis, U.S. government securities, they dumped them so that they had money to bail out banks. And if that turned out to be crap, then that would end up being inflationary. So, questions on that? I threw a lot at you there. Did we have super high rates of inflation?
No.
No. So economists like me and other people are like, okay, probably next year. It'll kick in next year. Uncle Milty had to be right? How is Uncle Milton wrong? My favorite economist of all time. The prediction from the quantity theory of money would have been that we would have saw maybe some unprecedented inflation, or at least getting up into, I don't know, 5% or something, So we basically saw zero inflation, even a little bit of deflation in a couple short periods. So what was different? I've actually hinted to you the answer in a couple different ways of why it didn't cause inflation.
Those companies that the central banks or the bonds central banks were holding to start to make good on those debts.
Slowly but surely, but there was bad ones too. So they did get wiped out. What was currency drain with our deposit multipliers? What was currency drain? There was two ways that we had currency drain, and if you remember, what did it cause for the multiplier effect? I walked you through the deposit multiplier where we had Kaylin finding the $10,000 in the backyard. She deposits it, $8,000 loan went to Daniel to go buy a car from Cousins Cars Are Us,
They don't.
right? Cousins Cars Are Us, deposited it in their bank, and then Andrew went and got a loan for his bathroom for $6,400, right? Remember that whole multiplying process?
They don't put all of their money in the bank. That's
They don't, so people don't put all of their money in the bank is one thing. So people choose to hold currency rather than investments. So they chose to hold currency. And then what was the other thing?
Banks don't loan it all.
Banks don't loan it all out. That's what happened. They weren't loaning out all the money. So they had money to loan out, but the bank of Kason's thinking, man, this financial crisis rocked my boat. This is kind of nice for the owners of my bank. This is like a big pillow. We can just rest our head. And if the next financial crisis is right around the corner, then let's just hang on to this. I'm going to need a bigger cash cushion than I've ever needed before. And so the Bank of Kason held on to that money. So to answer your question with the pendulum swinging earlier, was that you, Bryce, or about banks loaning out all money or not? After the financial crisis, they absolutely didn't. And so they had additional funds, but they weren't loaning it out. If they're not loaning it out, we're not getting the effects of the quantity theory of money. So the quantity theory of money, kind of what's underlying that is that banks would be close to operating at efficiency where they would be loaning out the money. But if we're holding money, then we didn't get the inflation that we did. That's kind of the moral story, and then kind of slowly but surely kind of work things out. The banks, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is still a bit distorted through different policies that they did over time. So they're still kind of heavy. There's still a decent amount of money out there, but they've slowly started to what we call unwind the economy, unwind the money supply, so that as some of these things get paid off, they don't go buy new ones right away. So as that money comes up back to kind of the normal days, as Trump cuts a check back to Jerome Powell, then the money comes back into the central bank, and we don't go buy another one. The money supply shifts to the left. So we've been a little bit letting that stabilize, slowly but surely, and then sometimes tinkering it a little bit, sometimes moving back and forth. Okay, questions or comments on that? That's why we do one chapter for this week, because the Federal Reserve, it's a big chapter. There's a lot of moving parts. It's an important one to spend your time on it, so don't take off the brakes. So any questions or comments in general about money? You guys have your project that you could do on Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is kind of related to money in a sense, or there's a little bit of a connection, so that might be interesting. Now that you've got the types of money or the functions of money, unit of account, medium of exchange, store of value, is Bitcoin meeting that, and where might it be able to be done? Who's the central bank in Bitcoin? That Japanese guy? Nagi, what's his name? Nagasaki, but it's something. Anybody else? The guy who invented it, basically, which is a bit of a mystery. If you guys haven't watched, if you start to get into the Bitcoin, or if you're going to do your project on Bitcoin, watch the Netflix show on Bitcoin. That's a pretty cool one. So there was a mystery behind it, because who's the central bank with Bitcoin?
Nobody. He said Trump.
Nobody. That's what's amazing about it. So
knows who first created.
if we now think about, I'll just do a little bit of fun with you. If we now think about Bitcoin, what does the supply of Bitcoin look like?
Is it whatever the demand is?
Whatever the demand is. So the supply of Bitcoin is fixed. We won't actually get there till I think they say 2038. So right now, Bitcoin is shifting to the right. So if we're here at 2020, each year a little bit more Bitcoin gets mined and released. But ultimately, in a fairly short period of time, we're going to have all the Bitcoins mined. And so the money supply will be fixed. And that would have been Milton Friedman's dream. Because now things are going to be determined by the demand for money. We don't have to try to figure out what the Federal Reserve is doing in terms of increasing or decreasing the supply of money. So this is something other economists too, if we have a money supply that's fixed, that's kind of a big time deal. Okay, questions there? All right, so let's see here. I feel like I've got a cool money supply video just to kind of give you guys a little video time. I definitely know one. We can look at Zimbabwe and their money supply, but let me see what I've got here. Oh, first of all, let me see if we got. I probably got something on Uncle Milty too. Inflation. Okay, there's that one. We'll watch that one.
Where's Dr. Reg from?
Oh, yeah, this is kind of cool. Yes, he's from there originally. Yep. All right, I think I'm going to take the fun one first. So, and that one we're going to watch later, so I don't want to spoil that one for you. But let's do this one. I lost my pointer. I hate that. Pen. Ah! Get this pen off. I hate when it does that. What do I gotta do? Help me. How do you shut off this damn pen? Anybody? Anybody? There we go. No? Oh, there we go. Select objects. Okay, got it. What? Oh, now I got that. Delete. I've never had this trouble trying to start a video. Excitement, total excitement. Okay, let me go back here.
One of the things that we put together as a display for some of our clients is a series of 27 official notes. This is currency from the country of Zimbabwe. And take a look here. This starts out at $1, and the date on it, I don't know if you can zoom in and see that or not, David, but in 2007, they had ones, and then of course 5s, 10s, and 20s. And this was the currency that was being used. As we well know, what happened is when hyperinflation started to kick in, and they started to print higher and higher denominations as people demanded more and more currency. And so they got up to 500s and the thousands. We're still in 2007. Here in 2008, they started printing in the tens of thousands. So in a period of less than 1 year, we went from ones, fives, to tens, all the way up to tens and 20,000s. We started looking up here at 50,000, 100,000, 500,000, or $1 million bills, and it just kept going and going and going. Let me show you over here. We get the billions of 1 and 5 and 10 and 20, and then here's a $50 billion bill on July 4th of 2008. A can of Coke would have cost you $50 billion for breakfast. But at lunchtime, it would be $100 billion. And by the time you got to dinner, it would be $150 billion. Their inflation rate, as you know, was approximately 10 to the 27th power. And something that's just staggering. And by the time they started printing, they said, well, forget the billions, let's just go to the trillions. So they started printing 10, 20, 15, $100 trillion notes. They hired a German company to print these. And they placed the orders for these, and by the time the German company was finished actually printing them, they weren't worth the paper and the ink that it took to make them. And so the German company never delivered them. They were never circulated. So these are all uncirculated banknotes, but it illustrates how fast, how quickly, and how devastating hyperinflation can be. In 2007 to 2008, in a period of less than 2 years, about 1.5 years, the currency imploded, and now they don't even have national currency in Zimbabwe. They have used hard currencies, gold and silver.
Quite a lesson, and one I hope no one misses that lesson. Thank you so much, Reed.
Thank you.
Buy real, get real. Me too.
Oh, this is for silver.
Yeah, this was just their thing. That was one of their promos. So I have $160 trillion in my office that I will bring on Friday for you guys to look at. $160 trillion, because it was the largest donation in the Gordon Institute history. Unfortunately, it was Zimbabwean dollars, so, but it was a large donation. It was very cool, so I'll bring that in. Here's the last thing for you. Here is one of my econ professors from Iowa State, when I was still there, sent this little chart that I've always shown students. So similar to what they were showing in the video, January 5th, February, March, this is when the hyperinflation started to kick in. So they're using the index, so this would be like your base year, right? When we chose the base year for inflation. And so 13% inflation. Now that's pretty bad already, it's monthly. And then it's 77, so they're just doing the percentage change, just like we do in this class. New price level minus the old price level divided by the old price level. 77, 56, oh, there was a little help there. 207, 70, 90. That's in November, and then it gets real fun. So 115, 5,000%, 2,000%, 3,000%, 12,000%, 45. This is the monthly interest rate. Monthly interest rate. 45,000%, 493,000%, and then finally 79,600,000. No, is that a trillion? That's a trillion. 79,600,000,000%. That's hyperinflation. All right, I'll leave you with that. We'll see you on Friday.
Yeah, that's not early.
Yes, mark your calendars. You're getting out early today. Celebration of the Chiefs Parade. You can now view it on our phone. And extra credit. Wow, what a good day. So Andrew, the next meeting is Tuesday, or not Tuesday, sorry, Monday at 3. We're just going to do it in the afternoon, Monday at 3. I suppose if you can't make that, we'll probably just say forget it, but can't make it. Okay.
Sorry about it.
We're gonna change the dates again next time so that more people can,
Oh, what are you doing it next time? Is that next year or next semester or whatever?
well, we'll have another event coming up this year with the colloquium like you did before. You did one of those.
Yeah, I did one, I think it was your first.
Saturday one, yeah. So we'll do one of those coming up in spring. The sheet, we didn't actually do the sheet today. So we had the extra credit, though you must have came in late. I'm thinking. Okay. So yeah, we had that at the beginning. What's your name? Hunter? Okay.
What tax form is called with your student loan information with the tax forms? We got a payment at the end of the year. So like a 1080 or? Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. We didn't do it today.
Oh, wait, well, okay. All right. Thank you.
We had an extra credit at the beginning for the Chiefs game.
Gotcha.
Um,
I'm talking about.